Actually, the rise of China has been very temporally and geographically varied. We've been looking at China and Africa, myself and Weiwei and others. Some of the links there go back to the kind of Maoist period of kind of socialist solidarity. We see links between cities in China and Europe, for example, that go back a long way. And we're going to talk a bit more, particularly Weiwei, about that. We have long-standing diaspora communities as well. So there's a whole set of ways in which China's internationalization has occurred, yet the current moment is really bound up in this kind of very tense kind of standoff between the US and China. And I think, the current kind of wave of internationalization of China has been, on multiple fronts, despite the kind of narrative. There's a thing called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a massive kind of infrastructure corridor linking China through to Central Asia. It has this type of a grand strategy, as though this is kind of coordinated by some kind of group within the Communist Party. Yeah, the kind of connections we see China making and diversity of Chinese actors, may be about resource access, it might be about infrastructure connectivity, it may be around aid, it may be around a whole set of things. And really we're trying to get a sense of that kind of the multiplicity of those relationships, rather than sort of focus just on this kind of seemingly intractable kind of geopolitical tension. And what we're focused on in REDEFINE then is really the period since about 2010. So we had the global financial crisis. China emerged pretty robust out of that. A lot of European countries were kind of, to put it in bluntly, skint, and then that had the follow-on to the Eurozone crisis, and countries like Greece obviously in a lot of trouble. So China then began to increase its investments into Europe from around 2012-13, which also was the launch of this thing called the Belt and Road, the BRI. So we see a kind of big upswing in investment from China from about 2013 to 2017. And a lot of this was in infrastructure, but also brand acquisition. So Pirelli in Italy, a tire company, Syngenta, a big biotech company, KUKA, a robotics firm in Germany, Volvo, obviously the big car manufacturers in Sweden, all bought by Chinese, but also real estate. And now we're seeing kind of big moves into electrical vehicles and battery manufacture across Europe. So a whole set of ways in which China now is investing in Europe and stirring up certain political issues. So next slide, please, Weiwei. But since kind of COVID and the Ukraine war, then the kind of, from a period of where, as I said, between about 2011-12 through to 2017-18, China was very much welcomed across many European countries. And I'm using Europe in inverted commas because and what we've been trying to pick up is the variegated nature of that kind of China-Europe relation. This move towards de-risking. So the G7 in Hiroshima last year, they don't use China. They talk about like-minded countries, i.e., not China. But the kind of onus was really on how do you de-risk these kind of investments. And so one level is about how you de-risk the investments themselves. The other way is how do you kind of wean yourself off China-centered supply chains. And so von der Leyen, again, about a year ago, made sort of very similar comments about China's coupling of military and commercial sectors, and how we need to sort of get Europe out of these kind of potentially risky relationships. So the mood has really changed, and we're going to pick up a little bit in all of that. But clearly what China's rise has done then, and this is the context of the project, is really ruffled the kind of liberal international order such that there is one. And we wanted to sort of use infrastructure as a lens to look at that. So if we can have the next slide. So theoretically then, I mean, we haven't got time to go into this. There's sort of certain set of problems when you try and do this. And, there tends to be a very functionalist view of the Chinese state. It's spoken as in a singular, as though there was this kind of centralized coordination of everything. And the Belt and Road is an example where it has been scripted as a kind of, mega sort of strategy to sort of take over the world. And in that, then you get also a very kind of capital centric logic on the other side, which is essentially saying China's got an overaccumulation problem. It has to export that overaccumulation through kind of infrastructure investment, get rid of your concrete, get rid of your steel, and all the rest of it. So there's, it's a very kind of one-dimensional kind of way in which investment is looked at. And they tend to then focus, where you do look at these relationships, very much kind of these elite set piece kind of bilateral agreements, where you often have Xi Jinping shaking hands with some, leader of another country. And, most of the analysis is focused on kind of bilateral and elite level relations, rather than a whole set of other relations that we want to explore a little bit more today. And we also think that, one of the dangers you get when with sort of some of the case study analysis that's been done, very good though it is, has been to sort of, you tend to sort of pick one project in one country and go, oh, well, look, there was a bit of corruption, therefore everything China does in all countries involves corruption. So there's no, China is treated as exceptional without any counterfactual kind of or comparative cases to say, well, it might be like that for all types of projects of this nature. So we're trying to do a kind of comparative study within REDEFINE. And we're doing that, if we could have the next slide, please, Wei Wei, through kind of framing it as the title of today's talk is around global China. So Qingquan Li, that pictured there, who is an anthropologist at UCLA, has been kind of pushing this agenda, I think, quite helpfully. And really kind of speaking initially, I think, to sinologists who are very good at studying China in China and what Chinese actors and processes and institutions do. But what happens when Chinese actors and institutions move elsewhere? How do you study those in a meaningful way? And as I said, a lot of that has been kind of single case studies of, this actor in this country doing that, very helpful. But really, how do you make sense of that in a more kind of global sense? And it's really the phrase that's used in the second quote is this idea of variegated footprints. So what we're trying to do with our project is an empirical project in the sense of, you can't speak to theoretical debates or debates in IR or whatever unless you have some decent data of what is actually happening, rather than extrapolating from what you think might be happening that was written in the New York Times, and which is how a lot of the kind of quote unquote analysis has been done. So yeah, we're really kind of trying to embed ourselves in fieldwork as we speak. Ken is in Hungary doing fieldwork, so he's joined us there today. And if we could have the next slide, please, Wei Wei. So what REDEFINE has done is, in terms of research design, is to look across 4 European countries. 3 are in the EU. 1 was and isn't, obviously, the big bluey green blob where we live, or some of us live. So yeah, we were trying to look at the sort of different kind of logics of the types of investment flows we saw. So today we're going to be talking about a case in Manchester. Wei Wei will be talking about that. And Ken's going to be talking about the bottom right corner, the case of Piraeus in Greece, a big port investment. And what we're really trying to do then is to move beyond those kind of geopolitical centric kind of accounts of tension and look at sort of subnational level actors and a range of other kind of processes that haven't generally been looked at when we do this kind of analysis. So Wei Wei's going to speak first, I believe, for about 10 minutes, and then Ken's going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then very kindly Filippo, who has been associated with REDEFINE and it's also looking at some of these things, particularly in Italy and Pakistan, is going to come in as a discussant for a few minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion. So over to you, Wei Wei. Thank you.
Thank you. Today I'm going to discuss one of the working paper I co-authored with my colleague Dr. Filippo Boni. Today is a discussant, and also Dr. Yamon Zhang from Xijiao Liverpool University. This paper really look at the local dynamics in global challenges and also help us to understand multifaceted nature of global China. Let's start. So, in the area marked by significant global challenges such as the COVID pandemic or the escalating geopolitical tensions, the importance of examining international relations beyond conventional state-to-state interaction has become increasingly evident. One example is that the COVID pandemic, with Wuhan, capital city of Hubei province in China, marked controversially by Western media such as BBC, New York Times, and VOA as the epicenter of COVID, which put enormous pressure on Manchester, one of Wuhan's sister cities in the UK. This scenario underscores the impact of global challenges, global events on local dynamics, and the interconnectedness of the cities worldwide. And second example is that the geopolitics. Very often, geopolitics overemphasize the national and international levels and overlook the local dynamic, which can provide alternative perspectives with deeper understanding of international relations. One example is the UK-China souring relation over the past several years. In 2022, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak officially declared that the golden era of UK-China relation is over. So what is under research is that the impact of the sour relation between UK and China at the national level to the local level dynamics, and how, for instance, the local entities respond to such a kind of shift of state-to-state ties at the national level. So it's also linked to the next question, that how we make sense of global China. Here we argue that in order to make sense of global China, we need to recognize its multi-nature of global China and delve into local dynamics, subnational mechanism. So despite, for instance, the souring relation between UK and China at the national level and the global challenges such as the COVID pandemic, the sister city relationship between Manchester and Wuhan has not only endured, but also deepened in its collaboration, showcasing remarkable resilience. So question raised, resilience, what explains such a kind of resilience of such a kind of relationship in the face of external shocks? Resilience here refers to the capacity of both cities not only to maintain the relationship, but also strengthen their collaborative effort despite of the external shocks. Before I elaborate more detail on our finding, I want to briefly introduce the rationale for us to conduct this research and pick particular on Manchester Wuhan as a case study. Firstly, is because of the long duration of this sister city relationship. The Manchester-Wuhan sister city relationship was established in 1986. So this long duration enabled us to observe the evolution and how this relationship encounter and adapt different kind of dynamic national, international context over time. Thus help us to understand what factors contribute to such kind of sustainability and resilience. And secondly is that this Manchester-Wuhan sister city relationship also exemplify as a model of successful all-round strategic partnership, which has been recognized not only at the national level between China and the UK, but also at the international level. And certainly is that this cooperation before the external shocks and after the external shocks enable us to observe, okay, what's the elements that has been put in together to contribute to this kind of resilience in this partnership. Now move to the next slide is focus more about some of the key elements we in our paper. And firstly is that in this paper, we propose a new contextualization of sister city tie as a form of strategic partnership with the feature of goal-oriented, with high flexibility and adaptability, and then also have the structure framework with the positive behavior of disposition and the process. Moreover, this strategic partnership also emphasizes both material dimension and the non-material dimension of cooperation, both at work and is of great importance. Material dimension of cooperation often refers to those tangible, easy to measure, physical, such as the infrastructure cooperation, investment, financial cooperation, attraction. While non-material dimension of cooperation usually refers to those less tangible or intangible or difficult to measure. For example, such as the cultural exchange, educational program, and to ultimately foster social trust or network building. And the second element for this paper is that we center our analysis on cities and treat city as international player. So here, we foreground the need to account for multi-level understanding of and the multiplicity of actors involved in international relations. So here, city not only treated as expansion of governments, but also as the host for political, economic, cultural actors that help to bring together to promoting boisterous city-to-city ties. So such kind of city-to-city ties sometimes align with, but also often depart in important way from national and international level dynamics. And certainly is that we adopt a relational approach in the study of city-to-city ties. And here we embrace the concept that power is relational and manifests within dynamics of interaction among actors. So relational power here concentrated more on the dynamics of relationship rather than on actors themselves. to recognize the relationality in this study is of great importance because when we look about the phenomenon of global China, very often the analysts overemphasize on how Beijing imposes its will to its host countries as if they are passive bystander of China's global strategy and ambitions. But in reality, for instance, in our paper on Wuhan-Manchester sister city relationship, we find that process and outcomes are co-constituted and generated by interaction on both sides, showcasing the active role cities can play in shaping their international relations. So in this paper, we argue that Manchester-Wuhan sister city relationship that exemplifies a model of successful strategic partnership. And the resilience of this relationship is significantly attributed to its emphasis on non-material dimension of cooperation, with guanxi and other forms of social capital playing a crucial role in blending intangible and tangible elements seamlessly. Guanxi here refers to a network of relationships that contribute to foster this kind of mutual benefits and understanding. The second argument is that we also, in this paper, we also illustrate the important dynamic force of city can play in international relations. And for instance, we found evidence that the power of localized engagement, for instance, at the city level, to maintain connection and transcend national and international disputes and controversials. And certainly is that we recognize the crucial role of city in enhancing international cooperation, understanding, and development by integrating the interaction between local efforts and global events. This is very helpful to provide us a unique contribution that city can make to enhance international relations. Now I can move the platform hand over to my colleague, Ken. Ken?
Thank you very much. Wait, can you hear me? Okay,
Yep.
Great. Thank you very much. So the case I've been looking at with my colleagues is the Port of Piraeus. So, first of all, I want to explain this term called dragon head. So the dragon head actually is from Chinese. It's quite positive. It symbolized the flagship of the project. It representing the most significant and prestigious project among all of them. Of course, in contrast, the term Trojan horse, I'm sure you are familiar with, symbolized elements of secrecy and concealed motives. Next, Wei. Thank you. So how the Port of Piraeus has been understood? So this has been invested by a large Chinese shipping company called COSCO. So overall, you have three levels of analysis. So at the structural level, this particular investment has been regarded as a result of the distribution of global power. So basically, from this perspective, that this has been regarded as China's geopolitical strategy to expand its influence, to compete with the United States and other great powers. At a state level, people argue that this is a solution, or in Harvey's term, a spatial fix for China's economic issues, such as trade surplus, foreign exchange reserve, and interestingly, the excessive interport competition within China. So from a Greek perspective, this project has been seen as a natural kind of extension of the Greek government's decade-long privatization efforts, which was basically compounded by the EU's austerity policy. At an individual level, you have arguments looking at this particular investment, arguing that this is basically the deal done by Greek ship owners, because Greek ship owners have a great influence in shipping policy in Greece. And this is also due to the personalities and networking of Costco's own CEO, who wanted to expand its political influence in China. So overall, it is quite state-centered, capital-centered in a way, a rationalistic approach to understand the project. So what's missing? Wait, next slide, please. So what we feel, we try to, as I said, provide a kind of a more comprehensive, a better understanding of China's overseas investments. So what we feel is these irrational factors, let's call it emotions, are missing. So first, I want you to understand why emotions with infrastructure, because we argue that infrastructure has a very unique ontological status. So according to Luxon and his cohorts, infrastructure has two aspects. The first one is functional. So we have been living that every day. So infrastructure could organize and govern our society, often in the name of science. It reworks space and time directly by facilitating, blocking, or creating flows and links of people, goods, and ideas. But importantly, infrastructure also has a aesthetic aspect, embodies desire and fantasies, acquiring fetish-like qualities, sometimes independent of their technical functions. So I want to draw your attention to these two pictures. They are not related to the project itself, but it explains the emotional aspects of it very well. So these two pictures are part of Shanghai. So the picture above is the Shanghai Bund. So you would see this is an iconic aspect of the Bund area. So it shows the architecture, the buildings from colonial area, and reflects Shanghai's history as part of the colony of the West powers, and also its financial and international trade hub in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And so at the bottom, the picture shows a Pudong area. So these two areas are separated by one river, so they face each other. So before 1990s, the Pudong area, the picture below, was basically farmland. Nothing is there, and every single building you see there is basically after 1990s. So now what you can see is the modern glass scrapers, symbols of China's economic rise and technological advancements for sure. But we argue that this is more than that. This new area is not just a statement of economic powers or expansion of urban space. It is a deliberate act by the Communist Party to showcase China's capabilities and aspirations. It is a symbol, it is symbolic repudiation of the past humiliation China faced during the colonial period, and it serves as a testament to the country's ability, or the Communist Party's ability, to reclaim, quote, the right place in history, unquote, in the world, and to assert itself as a global superpower. So this kind of, so when a lot of Chinese when they go to Shanghai, they went those places and took pictures, and when you ask them, they feel pride. So all these kind of things, they evoke different types of emotions, and emotions, of course, they are part of our life. They are quite important force that molds the interactions, the behaviors of individuals and collectives. From the pride evoked by national anthems to the resentment from historical injustices. So, for instance, I grew up in China, and I've been told, basically from mid-19th century till the first half of the 20th century, we call it the century of humiliation. So we feel that this is a part of our daily life, the infrastructure, and we somehow ignore it. one of the things I want to emphasize is emotions are not just, you know, how we feel about it. It also, it can do things. It has the capacity to shape and change social conditions and relationship. You know, they are form of social forces that can mobilize people, create bonds, and drive social changes. By extension, it's going to influence the development of infrastructure, which we are looking at. So we are looking at the what main emotions have been evoked in the process, and what do they do? So how they influence and reflects the development of the investment of port of Piraeus. Next slide. So this is still at a very early stage. So I have only been able to look at a few species and interview transcripts. And what I want to demonstrate is the emotions are absolutely full of parts of it, and you see different emotions from different axes. So these four kind of quotes are mainly from state level. So you will see the green bubbles demonstrates from the Chinese side. So again, this is the quote from from the CEO of the Piraeus container terminal. So he basically argued that, you know, Port of Piraeus is reborn, you know, only after 2 years of COSCO's takeover. Reborn is such a strong word. It's basically saying we are proud of it. We remake the whole port. And the other one is the dragon heads, as I said, very positive. And the other things you notice is from the Greek side, they also say the committee, the troika, is built on rocks and foundation. Okay, so you feel the sense of disgusting against the EU kind of institutions. Next slide, Wei. Thank you. Of course, this kind of a state level emotions are very different from other different actors, subnational actors. So you will see some activists telling us saying they feel so frustrated with the inactions of the government. And you look at the picture, that was taken in 2008, the day after the COSCO's takeover of the whole port, and saying, COSCO, go home. You know, we don't like you. And the other one is, you know, saying it's a giveaway of the property. It's not a simple investment. So what we want to demonstrate, I'm still working on the telling a more convincing story, is we feel the emotions adds a nuanced layer to our understanding of the Chinese infrastructure investments. So, you know, it is not simply an economic or strategic calculation, but also it is this particular looking at emotions help us to understand that the investment reveals a complex human and cultural dimensions here. So I think that's kind of I can tell you a little bit more after, but I think my time is up, and I'm gonna hand this over to Philip. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Filippo?
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thanks. I'll go ahead and try and make the most of the 5 or so minutes that I have. First of all, thanks to Giles, Wei, and Ken for the really insightful presentations, and for the opportunity to discuss those papers. Of course, I'm more familiar with Wei's work because I'm one of the authors there. But I thought Ken's presentation was really insightful. In my sort of brief remarks, I'll try to focus on what I think the papers share and what I think are 3 important contributions to our understanding of, you know, global China as a burgeoning field of study, but of China's international relations more broadly. First and foremost, I think the most obvious point that comes across is that these are really granular and grounded understandings of global China, and especially in a context like Europe, which has become one of the key battlegrounds in some of those grand geopolitical narratives, there is even more the need for these types of analysis based on field work and that type of data, especially because they allow us to move beyond state-to-state narratives and look at subnational and local levels. So what do the two papers, I think, really do, and they do really well, is to start drilling down on some of the footprints that China's global presence has left in the past few years across Europe. I think also what the presentations highlighted is that global China entails complicated, at times contradictory forms of state, sub-state, corporate, and personal relations. And this is something that it's often missed in grand narratives and in the headlines that we read in the Financial Times or the New York Times. And so in the case of the Wuhan-Manchester partnership, what we heard was how Guangxi, in a way, and people-to-people bonds have enabled this partnership to thrive and in many ways to chart its own course, departing from state-to-state dynamics. And in the case of Piraeus as well, which grand strategic understandings portrayed as Ken was saying, as China's bridgehead in Europe, we actually found evidence of greater resistance at local level. So rather than seeing the Belt and Road Initiative in China monolithically and all-powerful, I think what these two papers will do, and it's an approach which is fantastic to see, is that they really disaggregate the actors that operate in the context of China's internationalization, highlighting how a grounded reading of global China makes for a much messier picture than geopolitical analysis would lead us to believe. And beyond the clear and obvious, I think, academic value to this type of approach, I think there is clearly a policy-making dimension here, which policymakers would probably need to understand and listen to. Because especially when, I'm thinking here off the top of my head about the United States, where since the Trump administration, there seems to be a bipartisan and worrying bipartisan consensus that China is the main threat, without necessarily, understanding what the actual meaning of global China on the ground is. So there is a policy element here, which I think it's important to emphasize and which is key. So the second point, which I think the papers have in common, and it's also an important element, which I don't find that often in the literature on China, or especially on global China at this stage. It's the idea of how they focus on the less tangible implications of Chinese investments in Europe, so the non-material dimension. So in the case of Weiwei's paper, again, it's the idea of Guangxi and how that plays a role, among other factors, in fostering city-to-city ties, even when, at national level, things turn for the worse. And in Ken's paper, I really liked in your presentation, Ken, the juxtaposition of the Bund and the Pudong district. I thought that was really interesting, because it's basically the past and the present speaking to each other. And I would concur that there is a very strong symbolism behind that, especially if you think the Pudong district was built on farmland. So I think that's really a fascinating thing to look at. And equally, if you look at how emotions can play a role in the resistance against Chinese investment in Piraeus, I think that's also something which is really, really valuable and definitely worth looking, and something we're trying indeed to incorporate also in the Sister Cities paper. The sort of final point I'd like to make, and it's something that Weiwei has also hinted at in her presentation, is that both studies really try and make this a relational approach to understand global China. And this is really key because, especially when it comes to China, there is often a power asymmetry in its dealings with partner countries. Most countries are less powerful, both economically, militarily, but some would argue also politically. And so there is often the impression that China is able to impose its will, whether it's because it wants to invest in coal power plants, then you see coal power plants materializing on the ground. But actually the story is a much more complicated one, because domestic elites have a strong say in the way in which investments eventually unfold on the ground. So I think adopting this really relational approach, bringing in the Chinese perspective and the host country perspective, it really returns to a much more comprehensive, nuanced, and precise picture of what global China means and what China is doing internationally, with all its host of actors that operate within this very broad framework.